Hello, this is Johnny Chisholm, and I wanted to give you a quick demonstration of the features of our conservation planning training tool that we've developed in Arkansas. The main purpose of this is to train new conservation planners in the conservation planning process, and also to allow any planner to use this tool to develop official environmental evaluations, or CPA 52s. It looks similar when the form's opened to the EEPT or previous versions of Excel, except we have added a guide that shows the different planning steps. Also, if you scroll down, you'll notice that all the new resource concerns for all the land uses are listed, and they'll show up here. So basically, the process would be that planner completes steps one and two. When they do that, they would enter the client's name, conservation plan ID, the identification, client's objectives, etc., the main part up here. And then the first step after they get through steps one and two is to actually select the land use. And when they do that, they have the choices of selecting the land use and any applicable modifiers. In this case, we'll select the cropland land use. And we see as we do that, some recommended resource concerns to be assessed will begin to display. And as we select more of either the applicable modifiers or things like the nutrients are applied and pesticides are applied, you'll see that more of the recommended resource concerns for assessment will display. At this time, since nothing is selected in here, it is actually still an RMS. So if you created it at this point for cropland, it would have all the resources for cropland, and it would include all of the individual resources, and the planner would have to go through and document all of those. However, if you want to, you can click the select recommended. And once we have select the recommended ones, all the ones that are highlighted in green are selected. The planner can still go in and add others or actually remove some if they don't need some of those resource concerns to be assessed. So once we have that, if we click on the Prepare Form button here at the top, it takes us back to the CPA 52. And only the resource concerns for the selected land use are displayed on the CPA 52. Then, of course, at that point, the planner would proceed through the steps and inventory the resource and analyze the resource data. And at this time, they would conduct their field visits and either analyze the resources with CART or the planning criteria. And then they would go ahead and go into the next part of it, which would be identifying these resource concerns. So if we look at that, we can actually click on these and it gives us a drop-down choice list. You can also expand the column here so you can see more of the narrative. So once we do that, if we click on the drop-down choice list, at this point, the planner can document either that it's not a resource concern because it meets or the CART assessment, the existing condition is above the threshold, or it meets the planning criteria, or they could document that it is a resource concern because the CART assessment existing condition is below the threshold, or it does not meet the planning criteria. So in this case, if we said, well, this soil sheet and rill erosion, the existing condition was less than the threshold, so that means that it is a resource concern. And we would proceed through that process, moving down and documenting those benchmark conditions. For example, let's say the ephemeral gully, the CART assessment existing condition was above the threshold. And say the same thing on the classic gully erosion. So here you can see that the resource concerns that are, or the resources that are actually a concern are highlighted in red, whereas the resources that are not a concern are highlighted in green. Once we have documented all of our benchmark conditions, we can reduce this column from printing, and we go back to the next step in the process, which would actually be to formulate the alternatives. Of course, we could also document our benchmark for our special environmental concerns and human considerations, etc. But we've added a tool here that allows the planner it helps them to formulate alternatives by identifying practices that have the most or have points toward those individual resource concerns. So we can use those tools to help us see the points that they're going to get from CART and also identify practices that would address resource concerns. So we're going to use these formulate alternatives tools here by each land use. In this case, we're dealing with cropland, but before we do that, we'll scroll down and just show that all the resource concern benchmark conditions have been documented, and the resources that are red are an actual concern. The resources that are green are not a concern. So if we click on the cropland tool, it will take us to the formulate alternative, which will show us the practices that have points that would address or help address those identified resource concerns, the ones that are highlighted in red. And so when we get there, we see that the sheet and rill erosion, organic matter depletion, and the basically the nutrient losses to surface water and the sedimentation from erosion are displayed. These are the resource concerns we've identified, and we see individual practices that have points toward that. The planner has the choice. Right now it's set to a minimum level of 5. So at this time, it's going to display any practice that has 5 or more points toward that resource concern. The planner can change this to a higher number if they want to see less practices that have better results, or leave it like it is, just whatever they need to do. If they want to change it, they have to come up here and choose a drop-down choice. Let's go to 15, and we'll click this identify practices with positive effects. So then it only shows the practices that have a point value of more than 15 or 15 or more for any of these resource concerns. So as we go down through this, we can see that, there's some possibilities of different ways to develop the alternative. In this case, let's say, for instance, we're interested in doing conservation crop rotation and cover crop, and maybe residue and tillage management, no-till. So we choose those practices, and we can put a P in this column to show that these practices are primary practices, and then we can click Show Selected. When we do that, it will only show our selected practices, and we can look and see, well, for example, those practices, the cover crop and residue and tillage management, are going to have some effect on sheet and rill erosion and organic matter depletion, non-point surface loss, etc., but still may not reach the planning criteria. So you can use that. You can add other practices. And we can also just say, well, he might be interested in this alternative since it's kind of a simple alternative. So I'm going to copy these selected practices to my alternative 1. So I click that button. It will copy that information to alternative 1. And then maybe I want to identify more practices, so I can come in here and pick some other practices that might have some positive effects toward those things. For example, maybe we might need a terrace to help with the sheet and rill erosion. And you also have to click off of that cell. Since it's an Excel spreadsheet, you have to enter or click off of that cell. Maybe we might want to look at doing something like nutrient management to help with some of the nutrient loss. So I've picked a few more practices, and then when I click Show Selected, you can see that now we have more practices and we've got a few more points. So we're doing a little better in some of those. The nutrients to surface water is a little bit better. I think it would probably meet the planning criteria. Sedimentation or sediment from erosion, probably so. Organic matter depletion and sheet and rill erosion may still not be fully addressed, but I'm kind of happy with this one, so I'm going to copy this this selected one to alternative 2. Once I've done that, I'm ready to go back to my CPA 52 page, so I'm going to hit Return to CPA 52, and nothing seems to have happened here. You can also go in, and once we're done with these formulating alternatives, our next step would be to evaluate these alternatives. So I'm going to click on the Enter Practices, and there is a table for each land use. And notice, since I added these practices in the formulate alternative tool, I can also go in and add practices here manually one at a time by clicking a drop down and adding a practice. So you can still add them here, but generally it's probably easier to add them back under the formulate alternatives tool. So once I've done that, then I can click on save all practices and return to the CPA 52. It will actually populate the description of the alternative here in this cell, and it lists the practices that I have selected for both alternatives, and it populates the effects of those practices on this particular resource. And even if the resource is not a concern, there still could be effects from the practices, so it populates those and gives me an idea of what practices are there, what the effects are going to be, and it greatly streamlines the process of documenting the effects of those practices on those resource concerns and the human considerations. Of course, there's also places where the planner would need to populate some of this information, filling in any blanks. They would need to review this information, each narrative, to make sure it fits their local situation, and also to determine, for example, we looked at probably neither one of these alternatives would fully address the sheet and reel erosion. So in that case, I would probably want to check the not meet PC box for both of those, because neither one of them, even though they had some positive effects towards sheet and reel erosion, they probably didn't fully assess that to, or fully address that to planning criteria. So that's basically the way that you would do that. Of course, the rest of the spreadsheet, the special environmental concerns are not auto-populated. The planner would be responsible for recording the benchmark and the effects of the no action in alternative 1 and alternative 2. So that's just a little quick demonstration of this. You can stay tuned for more videos to see a more detailed process of going through it and developing the CPA 52. But this conservation planning training tool could greatly streamline the process and speed up the process as the planners go through and develop environmental evaluation for their plans.